Good afternoon, I'm John Koch, and welcome to Making Sense of Presidential Politics. That's the destination, the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We don't know who the next occupant will be, so we're sitting on pins and needles for the next 40 or 40 some odd days. My purpose is to explain why and how Americans choose a national leader, bringing coherence to the process beyond the pundit soundbite. It's more than about he said, she said, who's up, who's down in the polls, or who's in and out in the campaign. Fair available nightly on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox for you political pundits. Here are the topics we're going to be covering. What makes the U.S. system unique for electing a national leader? How did the electoral map change between 2008 and 2012? What does it take to be elected president? How does the vocabulary of presidential politics mirror the race for the nomination and election? What is the role of primaries, caucuses, and the National Party Convention in choosing a nominee? How does the electoral swing state pyramid and related charts capture the dynamics of presidential politics? How important was the margin of victory in 2012? How was the political landscape transformed in 2012? Why are demographics important in presidential politics, and how have they changed between 2008 and 2012? And how does the process and requirements of voting, including voter ID, inform the electoral contest? Well, there are a lot of topics here, and we may not be able to get to all of them in depth, but I'll do my best. It's hard to match the excitement and drama of American presidential campaign. It's a protracted, convoluted, and expensive quadrennial exercise in national ritual and renewal. It's protracted, takes 6 months from the earliest caucus in Iowa and primary in New Hampshire to the convention. 6 months prior to that, we have the invisible campaign, where candidates line up support, network, raise money, raise their profile, and get ready to jump in. And then after the convention, we have an Olympic lull for several weeks. The presidential year always coincides with the Summer Olympics. And then we're right into the fall campaign, 2.5 more months, with the election culminating this year on November 8th. And then we've got another 2.5 months of transition before the new president, the president-elect, is inaugurated. Now, as the most powerful office in the world, it's only fitting the candidates have to run a gauntlet, a 50-state gauntlet of primaries and caucuses to win this Super Bowl of American politics, juxtaposing issues, personality, character, competence, and experience. Choosing a presidential candidate who best personifies and exemplifies American values and beliefs, as well as the everyday concerns of Americans, is perhaps the most important choice an American citizen will make, other than a career and her spouse. And it can directly affect one's livelihood, as well as your life if you're in the military, and calls for the utmost thoughtfulness and rigor. So, being part of a presidential campaign is the experience of a lifetime. At the same time, it's also deadly serious, in which your livelihood and even your life could be on the line, especially if you're in the military. A winning message, along with authenticity, separates the successful candidate from an also-ran. Candidate must be viewed as authentic and trustworthy. He has to have an aspirational message to convey on where he wants to take the country. The candidate needs to stay on message most of the time, and there has to be a solid ground game targeting supporters and getting into the polls on Election Day. A winning message with authenticity, separates the successful candidate from the also-ran. Bernie Sanders, A Future to Believe in, Donald Trump's Make America Great Again, stand out in this cycle in contrast to Hillary Clinton's Stronger Together, not so much. Jimmy Carter also had a winning message in the wake of Watergate: the government is good as the American people. A losing campaign has none of that. Well, excuse me. In addition, a campaign staff on a winning campaign is disciplined, sharing discrete responsibilities. Staff shakeups are the exception, not the rule. All of that doesn't apply in unsuccessful campaigns. The candidate doesn't stay on message, frequent turnover in campaign staff. One campaign is on to its third campaign manager in this cycle. Campaign environment is this cauldron of conflicting egos and ambitions. Every campaign is like walking into a hurricane. But in a winning campaign, usually there's an eye of, at the eye of the hurricane, there's calm. In a losing campaign, you're going to find yourself in the fury of a hurricane with the chaos of cauldron of conflicting egos and ambitions at work. Now, most campaigns are not successful. In this cycle, we had 17 on the Republican side and 6 on the Democratic side. Of that, we have 2 finalists, one of which will go on to be president-elect. So campaigns have very temporary structures. The finalists will form the nucleus of the new administration, the White House staff, and the staff of the various government agencies. Let's ask ourselves some key questions. The political background of U.S. presidential candidates. What makes this election particularly historic? What are some of the peculiarities of presidential politics? And how do third parties impact on presidential politics? All those questions are relevant in this cycle. Of the 44 men who have been president, 9 were generals, including the first George Washington, 6 have been secretaries of state, 17 have served as governors or senators, 18 have been congressmen, and 14 have previously served as vice president, meaning that you have a 1/3 chance of acceding to the presidency as a vice president. While the president has multiple roles representing the U.S. symbolically as head of state, politically as head of his party, and in his constitutional role as commander-in-chief, electing a president involves the 2 other branches. Congress writes election law. The Voting Rights Act in 1965 was certain sections of that were overturned by the Supreme Court in 2013 in Shelby versus Holder. We'll talk about that a little later, which will directly impact on the results of the upcoming election. Similarly, the Supreme Court weighed in by halting the Florida recount in 2000, basing its decision on an obscure constitutional provision granting a safe harbor to electors from various states and overriding the fundamental constitutional principle of one man, one vote. It was a 5-4 decision. But it actually directly affected the result of the 2000 election. The other distinguishing feature about election 2016 is that the candidates have unprecedentedly high unfavorable ratings, which is going to impact on their legitimacy as president-elect, and at least at the beginning of his term. President Obama has already said that Donald Trump is unfit to serve. Does that mean he would ride down Pennsylvania Avenue with a President-elect Trump, or elect to decamp earlier than noon on January 20th? We'll have to wait and see. I want to go back and talk for a minute about the other aspects of the uniqueness of this particular election before we get into the issues. presidential politics, you get one bite of the apple. If you're the nominee and you don't make it, you're damaged goods and you're not going to get a second chance. The last person to be elected president who had been defeated on his first try was Richard Nixon, who lost narrowly John F. Kennedy in 1960, but recouped in 1968. On the Democratic side, the last person to get two bites of the apple was Adlai Stevenson in 52 and 56, running against national hero Dwight Eisenhower. He tried to get the nomination again in 1960, but he was edged out by John Kennedy, who was elected over Richard Nixon. Two other things make this election cycle unique. It's the first time, this is only the second time that a non-elective office holder has been nominated. And we have to go all the way back to 1940, when Wendell Willkie was the Republican candidate running against Franklin Roosevelt. He was defeated. So Trump would be the first non-elected candidate to assume the presidency if he's successful. The second point is that we have to go all the way back to 1940 for a Democratic candidate to be elected to a third term. If Hillary Clinton is successful, it will be the first time in 76 years that a Democrats have held the White House for more than 2 terms. The Republicans held it for more than 2 terms when George Bush succeeded to Ronald Reagan. That's Bush 41. The final point I want to make about presidential politics has to do with third parties. Third parties aren't quite up to the 15% margin required for debating at this juncture, but they have impacted results, even though sometimes they haven't carried states. The best example of that is Al Gore in 2000, who lost out to George Bush when Ralph Nader siphoned off several 100,000 Florida votes, which most probably would have gone to George Bush. Prior to that, we had the example in 48 when Strom Thurmond, running on a Dixiecrat segregationist platform, won 4 or 5 states totaling 70 some odd electoral votes. And the expectation was that that would deliver the election to Dewey. It didn't. Dewey also expected to win, and when he went to bed, he was so confident that he went to bed early. When he woke up in the morning, his Secret Service detail had departed, and at that point he woke up to the news that he wasn't going to be president. And going all the way back to 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin's cousin, tried to regain the presidency after giving his blessing to his successor, William Howard Taft, running on a third-party Bull Moose ticket. He won more electoral votes than the sitting president, but the election was won by Woodrow Wilson because the 2 Republicans had split the vote. Okay, let's take a break. Is that about 10 minutes?
Mm-hmm.